Good morning. Hemshech Chaim Beis, Volume 2. We finished the paragraph on page 1174. Okay. So to sum up, this end of this mimer here, mimer 140, we didn't do the end yet, the answer to the questions, but this last section is a conclusion of what began on page, in the bottom of page 1140, as I mentioned yesterday. So I want to just go back to 1140 and do it a little slower, because it'll just, to really do justice to these last 34 pages. So you may recall, on page 1140, you can turn there, and those that want to see the pages on PDF, if you don't have the Sefer, just go to ayinbeis.com. So if you look there, the mimer is a Rosh Hashanah mimer, and usually the Rosh Hashanah and the Shavuos Maimorim began new subsections within Ayin Beis. So after a long discussion, which you may recall going back months and months ago, pre-COVID, was about Shabbos and the weekdays, about Yom and Laila, Rotz and Shuv, all in the Pasuk V'yadaita HaYom. So there, at the end of the day, Lechem in HaShamayim, Lechem in HaAretz, was two ways of experiencing the divine. Lechem in HaShamayim was experiencing the divine as they did the 40 years in the Midbar, when they ate bread from heaven. Man was Ma. They experienced the mystique of the divine, which later becomes the language of Das Elyon. And Lechem in HaAretz, when we eat now bread on earth, that also is a divine creation. That the bread we eat is not self-made. It's not it's created by God, and there's a spark of the divine. That's why it gives us sustenance. However, it's sustenance on our terms. We don't feel the Das Elyon in it. It's Das Tachten. It's the Yesh, recognizing the Meitzeh Pi Hashem, the Ayin. That's essentially concluding a lot of pages on the discussion of, if you remember, Man and Shabbos and weekdays, which was all discussing Tzimtzum and Gilui in terms of the time of the week. The weekdays is more Helam, and Shabbos is more Gilui. So then, in the Maimer 1140, on Zei Yom Tchilas Masecha, he began to Birur of Existence. I'm just going to read a few lines just to give you the context. There's three lines from the bottom of 1140. Aleph Kuf Mem. Birur of Existence, Hine Beis Yedias Anal. Which two Yedias? At the bottom of page 1139. He said, Lechem in HaShamayim is Hamshachim al Maila Lamata. Lechem in HaAretz is Allah Lamata Lamaila. Like Torah and Tefillah, which of course is the two interpretations in Aramimcha Lekai HaMelech, which, as you remember, is the more broader theme that all this is discussing. Aramimcha Lekai HaMelech Mamayla Lamata, that you draw from Reimamus. Reimamus is Keser, transcendence, Elokus that's higher than existence, into Lekai HaMelech, Aramimcha Lekai HaMelech, into Lekai HaMelech, how Elokus becomes a Melech, Malchus, and Elikai from the word koyach, or that's through Torah, that's like Lechem in HaShamayim, or Lechem in HaAretz, Mamata Lamaila, the Yediyah Tas Tachten, that you begin from the bottom up, which is Aramimcha Elikai HaMelech, Mamata Lamaila. You start from Elikai HaMelech, and Aramimcha, you elevate Elikai HaMelech to this higher level of divine experience, which is really where the Magid, the Torah of the Magid, Aselecha Shtei Chatzetzes came in. Shtei Chatzetzes, the two halves, Chatzot Sudas, which begins the whole discussion that we're all in the middle of a long parenthesis. I'm just putting a little more context here. So then he says, so at the bottom of 1140, so these two Yediyas, these two perceptions or perspectives from a top down and bottom up, that's what it says, Kikel Deis Havaya, that the Idre Zuta, which he's quoting here as well, which we just learned yesterday, the same Idre Zuta, that Deis Vadai, there's two Deis. It doesn't say Kael Deya. that God is a perception, God's perspective. It says deyes, two perspectives. That's das tachten and das elyon. A das tachten, as we learned yesterday, is between moichin and midas. It's the bridge between intellect and emotions, and that's why it says bedas kol palteri yismalin tiksiv bedas chadorim yimalun. The pasuk says with das, the chadorim, the chambers, the rooms are filled up. What is cheder? She explains there, chadorim is midas. So das fills up the midas with the infusion of intellect. So the mind is giving birth to midas, and das is that channel, because das, as we spoke, is intimate knowledge. So midas, which is the Rosh Tevis cheder, chesed din rachamim, that basically chesed gvura teferes. And that's where he says that's the first level of das. Okay. He elaborates a bit more on top of 1141. And then he says, okay, 1 second, that's no. Das achre lo yizgalya. And then there's another deya. There's another, that's a das that's revealed. It's carrying intellect, mind into emotions. Then there's a das achre lo yizgalya, and that's the second level of das elyon. Like he says, das tachnu das elyon, das tachnu sheboy v'hayodu ikir hagili ba'midas. Okay, that's why das is called maftecha de kol shis. I'm just reading some select lines from the beginning of this discussion. It's called the key that encompasses all six, the six midas. Okay, that's chayes hamidas. Das elyon shetomir v'nelam v'leis galia. And the higher perspective is covered and concealed and not revealed. And yet he says, just an interesting parenthesis, because das is gili. The only difference is it's a gili that's concealed. That's what he says essentially. But it's a das hanelam. We discussed this as well. This was also Tzadik Daled began with this discussion as well. So it's a gili, meaning it's not fundamentally concealed. Its purpose is gili. Remember, Ayin of Yesh HaAmiti and das elyon is also a gili. It's just a higher gili that's beyond us at this point, because from the perspective of the tachten, it eludes us until we reach that level. Okay. Then he continued. I'm reading middle of page 1141. Ulahavin zeh ha'inyan hudini yedua de b'chlal seshtalshus mereish kol darg v'atzev kol darg yesh gimel madreges hem b'chinas yesh v'ayin v'yesh. So here you see the flow. So he began with the two levels of das, goes into yesh ayin v'yesh, and that begins a whole discussion. First, what is the yesh? In the root, it's yesh HaAmiti, yesh HaNivra, atzmus, the true absolute reality, the creation, the created reality, and the ayin be'emtza, and then that ayin breaks into two, and that becomes das elyon and das tachten. That in the ayin, in the oir itself, which is gilui, there's a gilui from the perspective of the source, where the yesh is the reality and ayin, everything is nullified. That reflection from the way Atzmus looks at it, and the four different levels and interpretations of what that ayin is, four ifanim, four ways how that ayin manifests, that bittul. And then there's the ayin of the yesh hanivra, the ayin that relates to existence and manifests in existence. Like I said before, lechem min haaretz type. First one's lechem min hashamayim. He's going to, by the way, connect it soon, a little later, to those two levels of lechem, of bread. And that's where we are. So then he went into the two levels of ayin, at length explained where they are positioned, where are these two levels of ayin, with a primary discussion about how it is in er pnimi, the pnimius of er, the etzem of er pnimi, and the hispashtus of er pnimi. Or in other words, the pnimius of the kav, chetzenius akav. But in the process, we also learned how these two levels of ayin are in atzilus, in keser, biyah, and atzilus, and all the way to pnimius akav and chetzenius akav, all the way lifnei at tzimtzum, malchus of ein sof and teferes hanelam, as we learned the two roots of the inner and outer dimension of the kav, and even higher, etzem ha'er, nispashtus ha'er. So now he's tying it all up and saying, okay, now we have these two levels of das. These are the two orders whether your spheres are one under each other, then das is the das tachten, because it connects meichin to midas, or the order of the structure of three kavim, three tracks, where you have das tachas hakeser. Keser and das. Das goes straight to primis hakeser and all the way up to das, that's das elyon, the perspective from above. Okay. That sums it up. I'm ready to finish the mimer now, unless somebody has a question, wants to ask anything. Okay. Okay, with that said, so let's finish the mimer then. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of the mimer, the questions. So Yom Shemini Atzeret mimer. And the Rebbe Rashab in the beginning of the mimer, page 1168, asked the following questions. It says, "But Yom Shemini Atzeret tia lachem." The Medrash Rabbi gives an example. What's Shemini Atzeret? A moshel of a king who threw a party, a meal, for 7 days, and invited all the people of his empire. And then on the 8th day, he came to his beloved, not all the people of the nation, of the people, La'oyavai, and says, we now finished Kfar Yotzanu. We did our obligation to the Bnei Abedina. So now, Bov and Negalgul, Aniva Ata B'Mesha Timtzum. Let us, you and I, meaning the Melech and his loved one, beloved, let's come together and spend time together. Negalgul means G'drein Tzazam, hang out. Same thing, the 7 days of Sukkos is the party, and you bring 70 bulls, Shivim Podas, Keneged Shivim Umis, 70 nations. So essentially it's celebrating and elevating all the nations. That is the 7 days. And Yom HaShmini, the Eibishter says to Yisrael, to the Jews, to the Jewish people, come now, let's together celebrate with Pad Echad V'Ayel Echad, what we have. So it's not 70, it's 1. So ask the Rebbe Rashav, what is this inyan? That 7 days you bring these offerings, which corresponding to the 70 ministers representing the nation, 70 nations. And Shemini Atzeret is for Israel, but you only bring one. That's one question he asked. What's this moshel? What is the meaning behind it? So now he's going to explain that based on what we learned about everything we learned about these 2 levels of ayin, 2 levels of das. So he says, now, Yuvan, according to the above, we'll understand, Masha Kosev b'yem Shemini Atzeret tia lachem. And the 8th day will be an Atzeres. Atzeres means it can be pause, it can be a day of rest. Many different meanings of Atzeres. It should be a day of Atzeres for you. The Shiba Yimei HaChag, in the 7 days of the Chag, remember Yom HaShmini tells you there's 7 before it. So even though on one hand Shemini Atzeres is a Chag b'fnei atzmei, but it's still called 8th day. So on 8th day, it's coming after 7 days. So 7 days of the holiday Sukkos, Hikrivu Ayin Purim. Reading at the bottom of page 1174. They offered 70 bulls. Va'inyan hu, what's the inyan in this? She says, Va'inyan hu nizbar le'il. The inyan of this was explained earlier in the Maimer, Dibra Masla Anoichi Anoichi. The bebchinas ha'ayin shel Yesh HaAmiti. I'm sorry, no. The bebchinas ha'ayin shel Yesh, it actually means a Yesh HaNivra. Liyah shababi slapshus, v'halomish, because the ayin of the yesh of existence, the lower level of ayin, because it comes in the form of islapshus. Remember, it's not above and removed. That ayin engages with, gets enclosed in, v'halomis, islapshus v'halomis. It comes into a manifest way and gets concealed within the yesh hanivra. The yesh. The reason he says yesh, because remember he also referred to yesh hanetzal. So maybe that's why he's not saying Yesh HaNivra. But Akaponim, so he's saying, so that ayin, that level of the divine that manifests within existence, there, Shaykh Bezeh, we learned in the Maimer Nechi Nechi, there you can have an achiza v'yanika. Because the divine is relating to existence, it's not above it, so there's possible there should be an achiza and a yanika, meaning that the negative energy should be able to wean, should be able to nurse, and have some grasp in this level of elikus. If you remember at the end of the Maimer, Anochi, he spoke about it at length, relatively at length. He spoke about that when you're dealing with the Ayin of Yesh, you're dealing with elikus. That shaykh is basically like we say shchinta begalusa. The Shechina, God, is above Golus, but there's a level of godliness that engages and relates to us. So essentially, that level of elikus, the negative energies can basically exploit, or in some ways, wean energy from there. So yes, so there's shaykh bezeh achiza. I'm going back. If you want to see where it was in Anochi, look on page page 1160. 1160 spoke about the in detail how the koyach halaki that gets concealed, and that's why there's possible that there should be achiza. The words he used, hester acher hester, at sheyachal yisavs chinis yesh, v'nifred gomer k'may elakim acherim. The bottom of page 1160. Sheyem kim b'chinis acharayim, the acharayim d'shem elakim amahava kol hamugbolim. In Das Elyon, that's not shaykh, because Das Elyon is completely consumed with divine presence. All it is reflecting a lakus. The lakus that relates to existence, there can be an achiza after many concealments. That's what he's saying here. Well, okay. Okay. So therefore, that's what the 7 days is referring to. Because the 7 days of Sukkos is being mevarer, the elikus that relates the king as he relates to the 70 nations of the world. So by bringing the bulls, the purim, we're actually doing is elevating those 70 nations. In other words, they shouldn't have a yanika. That's what he's going to say now. But that's Sukkos. Shemini Atzeret is clearly going to be me and my beloved. It's going to be pure elikus, not about elevating and, in a sense, preempting the yanika of chitzenim. So he says, Achai de gile ha'er. So even though there could be a yanika, because the energy now is relating to existence, so there can be, the negative forces could feed off of it, because it's not pure Gilead Lakus. Pure Gilead Lakus doesn't leave room for anybody to come. It's like a physical example. When the light is shining, you don't see the maggots. Where do they gather? In corners, where it's dark, where there's moisture. But as soon as you pick up a rock and you see all these creatures crawling everywhere, what's happening? Because they don't survive in the light. They need to come where it's darker. So where the elikus is more betzimtzum, there's always more room for the negative side to feed off of it. So how do we counter that? He says, Achai de gili ha'er. So when you bring the gili ha'er of Sukkos, ubefrat ha'idei hamshachas ha'er makif, and especially not just gili ha'er pnimi, but er makif, which is the more transcendent energy. Nase habir shalehem. That's how that's how you refine the negative energy, the negative side. So, and you prevent it from drawing energy to the wrong. So in other words, it's bitla hayesh. Like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that everything that's bottled, that's kedusha. What's kedusha? Bittel. Something is holy when it's not about itself. The opposite of kedusha simply means ego, self. It's about me. Once you have a me, like the Gemara says, Ein ani v'hu yechelim. What's the word? Yechelim ladur tachas kfifa achas. That I and him cannot dwell under one. There's no room. Like when you have a cup that's full, you have no room to put anything in it. When a human being is filled with himself, there's no room for a lakus. The Kotzker Rebbe was once asked, where is the Eibishter? He says, wherever you let him in. If you don't let him in, so you have the self. So the self is the, however, when you bring the karbonis, which is amshachas ha'er, especially er makif, you're introducing a level of bittul, and b'meila there's a bitter of that lower level. But that's the lower level. V'zeh iyin ha-karbonis. And that's the iyin of the offerings that are brought. Shu'in ha-birur. A carbon is birur. What is a carbon? Adam ki yaakov mekem carbon l'Hashem. We learned it in Basal Gani. that Alter Rebbe's teach, ki yakim mikem. So what exactly is it? That we take the nefesh habamis, a behema, and you bring it on mizbeach, and what do you draw out from it? The blood and the fat, which is the passion and the grobkeit, the passion and the yeshus and the chumrius. That's called a korban, malosh and kiruv. You're essentially elevating the nefesh habamis. That's the mizbeach hachitzon. Mizbeach hapnimi is a different aveidik, teres. But mizbeach, that's what it is. It's birur hagashmis, hayesh. Shuna birur, v'hainu shemevarim ha'ayin sorim. So on Sukkos, you're being mevarer, the ayin sorim, the 70 ministers. Obviously, we're talking here the celestial ministers, meaning the ruchnis dike sar, like a Shmuel. I'm sorry, Shmuel has a sar, Esav had a sar. So you mevarer the ayin sorim, ayde hagili eir, through this gili eir that the shemamshichim, the gili eir that we draw down through these karbonos. So a carbon is Allah adraza the Ein Sof, like he says in the Maimer, and you draw down. So that's what you're doing. So Sukkos, the 7 days of Sukkos, now it's Mishalma Parim Svasenu. We only do it through speaking through our lips, but we're fulfilling that same idea when we say Sukkos each day in Musaf. We say the different we mention this karbonos. It goes down, and the total of 70 karbonos through the 7 days. It's Birur ha'umas, it's basically Birur ha'elam. So now top of page 1175. So all this is possible only in Chetzenis that relates to the world, to the existence. If it doesn't relate to existence, you don't even have room. There's no birur. The word birur we know means to clarify, to separate. That's what birur means. When you have two things mixed together, you mevarer, you clarify, whether it's a birur halacha or a birur gashmi. So birur is only possible where there's something that there are two things that can be confused or they can be mixed together. Like we learned at length earlier about birurim, Shabbos and the weekdays. Shabbos is higher than birurim, the different levels. So that's only shaykh in the era, shaykh al-ilmus. Ve'esa ha-birur b'chitzenis ilmus. And you create that birur, that clarification, and that separation, and hopefully that zichuch, that refinement, where chitzenis ilmus. Chitzenis elements that are receiving energy from chitzenius ha'er, and that chitzenius ha'er where there's room, leaves room for a unika. So you're preempting it, or you're correcting it, or repairing it, refining it through this 70 karbonos, 70 offerings that correspond to the 70 nations. Now we go to Shemini Atzeret. Aval b'chinas pnimis ha'er, which is the Ayin, Bechinas Ayin HaAmiti. When you talk about Pnimis Ha'er, you need a Chelik Beis there. Second exhale. But Pnimis Ha'er, that's the level of Ayin HaAmiti. What that means, the Ayin of the Yesh HaAmiti. That's an Ayin that's completely consumed with divine consciousness. It's only a reflection of Elokus. That's obviously higher than all the birurim. There's no birurim even. You're dealing with if lifnei tzimtzum l'sed machshava no emlech that we learned. Actually, that's not even Ayin of Yesh HaAmiti. We're talking about, but even that, Ayin of Yesh HaAmiti is about elokus. It's about godliness, not about changing the world, creating and changing the world. So that's higher than birurim. V'hi ha'amshach b'bchinas primis ha'elmus. I know he introduced now Chetzenis Elmus and Primis Elmus. Till now, he didn't discuss those two levels. He just talked Primis Hakav, Chetzenis Hakav. But essentially, it's the same idea. In the Elmus itself, in the world itself, you have the Chetzenis Elmus, which is the world that we deal with on a regular daily basis, or the 7 days of Sukkos that elevate that. And the Primis Elmus, that's the Eir, that's the Amshach B'chinis Elmus, Hainu B'Primis Ha'eses Firis. In the premise of the Esses spheres, which also, till now he said the premise of the Kav, but the premise of the inner sphere, 10 spheres, U'b'neshamis Yisrael dafke. Remember, previous page, he said that Amshach is the Neshamis Yisrael. This is dafke to the souls of Israel. This is not about the souls that relate to existence. This is Neshamis Yisrael, Bonim Atem, he said. This is Oyavay, in the Moshel and Medrash, about Shemini Atzeret, this is the beloved. that God is now speaking to his beloved. So 7 days of Sukkos, he made a party, a Suda, a meal, a malt site for everybody, for all his creations. But now he's speaking to his beloved, sometimes compared to the princess, the Bas Melech, sometimes Ben Melech. But Al Kaponim, you're talking now a much more intimate connection, which is the Pnimius Elemis. Remember, Chitzenius focuses on the function of creating Tachtenim that God wants to make a Dira B'Tachtenim. Pnimius focuses on God's Kavana. What's the deeper Kavana in the paintbrush to create? Why are we creating all of existence? So now we move to that. Pnimius Elemis, Pnimius Esesvidis, Odafke Neshamis Yisrael. And that's the muscle. Zehu bo v'negalgal aniva ata. And that means you and I, come.
It should be boy. It's a mistake. Not boy. The verb before the aleph.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Boy and a galgal.
Exactly. Yeah. You're right. In the beginning of the Maimon, he doesn't even have a vav. He just says bo.
Boy. It's chaylam. Okay,
got it. So now comes boy negalgal aniva ata. Again, negalgal means let's join together, let's party together. I and you. That's what Hashem is saying, the Melech. Shehi am shachal neshamas Yisrael levad. This is now a party of only two, not a party with 70. This is only two. Aniva ata, dafka neshamas Yisrael. V'zeu b'yem Shemini Atzeret tiyeh lachem. And this is the meaning. B'yem Shemini tiyeh lachem, dafka lachem. That's what Shemini Atzeret is, lachem, to you. So it's a personal thing. This is the experience of the Ayin of Yesh HaAmiti. That's where you're that gili of Shemini Atzeret. V'yadua, and it's known. The Shemini who b'chinas pnimius habina. 8. Remember Shemini now, he's explaining the connection to the number 8. What is the number 8? It's pnimius habina. Remember, 8 is the 8th sphere from the bottom. You go Malchus, Yesod, Hoid, Netzach, Tiferes, Gvura, Chesed, and then comes Bina. So Bina is the second from the top, from Chachma, but it's the 8th from the bottom. So Shemini refers to 8. Now, I know some of you remember, don't you remember he said that we don't count Malchus, and therefore Bina Shabbos is Shviyah Alayu is number 7. So the Rebbe Rashab is covering that base as well. He says, "Uleil dibra maschel shomer yom Shabbos." In the Maimon that's shomer yom Shabbos, he said, "Nizbar ba'efen achar." This was explained in a different way. That what? That Bina Shvi, and the Rebbe Rashab says, "Va'ayim ponim l'teira." There's 70 facets to Teira. In other words, there's different ways you can explain it. They don't have to always be consistent. Even though I'm sure you can explain, but he says, I am ponim l'teira. Not so common in Chassidus that it brings that. But that's what he says here. That Maimer is explained differently, which also tells you that not everything has to always be reconciled. It's not a stira, obviously. It's two different ifanim of how this idea is explained. Okay. So that's Shemini is Pnimius Bina. So we see from that, that's already Pnimius Bina. That means it's higher than the Elemis. Because it's the Elemis is when you go into Midas, the Zayin Midas. Here it's Pnimius Bina. He also adds, and Shemini is also Loshen Shemen. Comes from the word Shemen, oil. Also from the word Shuman, what's Shuman? Thickness. But he doesn't say that. But Shemen is thick.
I just want to add something. We just came from, at that point, we just came from sitting in a sukkah, which is Makav the Bina, and went into a Panemius. It fits in very nicely.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. And that's why we couldn't sleep there, right? Because the Makifim of Bina. So maybe on Shemini Atzeret you can sleep in a sukkah. Because it's no longer Makifim, it's Panemi. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate. We don't sleep in a sukkah on Shemini Atzeret either.
Pnimius Bina could be is higher than Makifim the Bina. Because
It's definitely more begili. Okay, fine. Good. So now he says like this. Now also Shemen is also connected to this level. We Shemen Hatev. Shemen Hatev, we learned in the first volume of Ayin Beis, was Narichas. He explained the difference between Shemen and Ketores. You may recall. So Shemen Hatev, a Yered al Azokin. So he said there, Shemen Hatev is not just Shemen. Shemen itself is already a high level.
Shemen HaKtoires. There are no such things, Shemen HaKtoires.
No, I didn't say Shemen Hakteris. Shemen Hatev.
Oh.
I said in volume 1, he explained. I said he explained in volume 1 the difference between Shemen and Ketores. That's what I said. But Shemen Hatev is not just regular oil. Regular oil is also, we call it rosin daraisa, secrets of Torah, like the oil that's hidden inside the Shemen. But Shemen Hatev is considered especially good oil, the best, because the oil itself, the Gemara tells us that when you press oil, there's different pressings. And the question is, when you get the rich Shemen Zayah or Shemen Hatev is the best of the oil, the best quality.
Shemen is
Shemen Hatev.
Rosin der Rosin. Shemen bechlal lereach shmoneh chotovim. Yayin is rosin. Shemen.
Now Shemen Hatev is even deeper. And what is that level? Pnimius Atik. So it steams very well because we said Shemini Atzeret is connected to the Ayin of Yesh HaAmiti, Das Elyon, and we learned that is Pnimius Atik, Shemini, and Shemen. V'hu b'chinas Ayin HaAmiti. And that's the level of the Ayin HaAmiti that, as we said, Ayin HaAmiti means the true Ayin of total bittul, canal, as we learned earlier. V'alzeh Eimer, Atzeret tiyeh lachem. That this transmission, this Hamshacha, is dafke lachem, dafke l'shamis Yisrael, not to the Ayin Sodim, the 70 ministers. And this is the meaning of B'yem Hashmini Lachem, the Hamshacha, the B'chinas Das Elyon, that the Hamshacha, the transmission of Das Elyon, the perspective from above, that comes from the inner and the core of Ein Sof, Hi Lochem Dafke. So the Yem HaShmini, the Hamshach of Shmini, Pnimius Bina, all the way to Pnimius Keser, should be Dafke Lochem, Ukemeshkosov Yehi Lechol Levatcha, Ve'en Lezorim Mitach. He will be for you alone, and there will be no strangers there. This is where the source in the Zohar, Ano Malkab L'Chidei, doesn't bring that expression, but it means the last day. Shemini says, when Abraham says, Boy aniva atov and boy v'negalgal aniva ato. That now we're not dealing with refining the world. We're not dealing with how Elikus relates to existence. We're dealing with how Elikus relates to itself, and how the neshamas are basking and connecting with godliness on his terms, not on the terms of Elimus, of the world.
Ano nosav malko.
Anonisima, yeah.
So that means Shemini Atzeret is higher than Sukkos.
Aleph Kuf Ayin Hey. What?
Shemini Atzeret is a higher gilui than in Sukkos.
In this Inyan, yeah, that's clearly. The Medrash says it. It says Aniva Ato, so it's clearly a higher level. But what's beautiful about it is that you have both levels, because Sof Kol Sof, the Tachlis Aveda is both. You need to be Mavar of the world, but the downside there is that then it's a Likus that relates to the world. But you also want to have Shachi, you want to have experience of the Elikus and divine on his terms. And that's Shemini Atzeret. So it comes together beautifully. This is all of Yiddishkeit is going to be Yemei Sachel and Shabbos in a different way is the same idea. 6 days of the week, it's a slapshus of Elikus in existence. And they're the Birurim. Shabbos is a day, Shabbos LaShem. I mean, whatever you learn. As I've said many times, Ayin Beis is the story, the whole theme of Ayin Beis is one word, memutza, interface, which is really the whole theme of Yiddishkeit, Torah, especially Kabbalah and especially Chassidus. Now what? How does a limited, finite nivra, a yesh v'chumri, connect to Alakus and atzmus that's beyond anything. We can't even call it gvul and bli gvul. Even nivra and beira. In every possible way, Elokus is opposite of who we are. And yet God created us. So the question is, Naseichel dikaway, how do you connect these two? Kol yochel, you can do anything. But that's not how it works. The Eibishter created Seichel, and he created Midas, and he created a system. We may not ever understand why he created this system, these laws of logic, but that's how he did it. That we know, he did it. And he wants us to understand it. V'yedaita hayem. V'ashavesa levavecha, the operative pasuk, which we're going to come back to soon. So how can you explain such a thing? Comes Teda and says, Teda is, the Eibishter gave us a Teda, created the human being, B'Tselem Elokim. So he gave us tools and embedded within us, within existence, within Seder Shtalshus, a system of stepping stones that we can move from the grobste Tachten Shein Tachten Lamatem Meno to the highest levels of Atzmus Bilte Metzias Nimtza. But that's only possible through Aveda. But there's a system, there's steps, there's stepping stones. So the Eibishter gave us all these steps in order to teach us, firstly, how he created. The Eibishter doesn't need anything. He could have said, I want a world. Gendik. You don't need Eid Ein Sof. You don't need Lifnei Tzimtzum. You don't need a Tzimtzum. You don't need a Kav. You definitely don't need a Seder Shtalshus. But then it wouldn't work. There wouldn't be a relationship. It would go against the whole purpose of Dira b'Tachtenim. He wants a Dira in Tachtenim. He doesn't want a Dira in Atzmus. He wants the Dira Leyes Baruch Atzmuse in Tachtenim, which itself is already two extremes. So that's why he creates a whole system. First of all, to understand how it creates. The Eibishter didn't need Asara Mamoris. I remember someone once asking me in a class, he said to me, why did God need 6 days to create? He couldn't do it in one day. So I said, let me put it to you this way. If you can't create in 6 days, you can't create in 6,000 years. And if you can create, you can create in 1 second. He didn't need 6 days because he got tired or because every day, because 6 days is the way he wants existence to be. That's the logic of it. He wanted to be. Of course, he could have done it like this, but then you wouldn't have a relationship. It would be an Eibishter B'Shafen Welt. It'd be airtight. We would be, at best, you could say we'd be like Avodim. An Eved doesn't have to understand his master, his Odin. He doesn't have to feel, doesn't have to love him. Just do Kabbalah Sale. That's not what God wanted. Not in the Torah, it says clearly, Yediyah, Hargosha Belakus, V'haftas Hashem Elekecha, V'yedaita Yem Dasa Lekei Avicha. And then the logic of it, he created us with Seichel. He created us with a system. And you want Yiddishkeit zu durchnehmen, should permeate us as individuals. Hence, we have this whole thing. So wherever you're going to look in Torah, you're going to find always 2 dimensions. Look, in simple things I pointed out many times when we learn. Every bracha you make, you're saying the mamutza. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam, shehakol niheh b'dvarei. The first half is not focusing on what, it focuses on the Eibishter. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam. It's all about God. Shehakol niheh b'dvarei, that everything was created with his dvarei. That's the tachten. And you bring them both together. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu beida minim b'zeinis, beida priya gofen, alechem mitzi lechem min haaretz. Or if you say the longer bracha, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech asher kedushanim mitzvos v'tzvonu al achilas matzah, al hadlik ner Chanukah. What do you see from this? That you always have both. You want to bring a lakus, but you want a lakus to come into the pratim. But al piseichel, they don't work together so easily. So first you have to work from your bottom up. First you try b'chol levavcha, as Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha. Then you move to b'chol nafshecha, and then b'chol meidecha. Why don't you jump straight to b'chol meidecha mesiras nefesh? Because it doesn't work. So from time to time, there's moments like that. There's Eis Rotzen, Yom Kippur, the Dalek Shur. You have special days, special moments. But Tmid and Kisidram, in a regular way, with Tachtenim means God wants it in the regular, he wants it in the ordinary routine. He doesn't just want once in a while you have a spurt and a high. He wants it to come bislapshus, Tachtenim. And that's where you need Damshach Lamata. I remember, just to point it out, I think I mentioned this. Remember once a very beautiful sikha that captures it so well. Famous, we say every morning, Shnei Aksuvim, Sheiksuvim Machishim Zeh Zeh. 2 psukim will come and they contradict each other. Comes the 3rd pasuk and reconciles. So of course the big question is, what do you need a 3rd pasuk? Why don't you have the chatchila the 3rd pasuk? Why do you need one pasuk like this, one pasuk like that? They contradict, and then you have to go struggle and find how do you reconcile. So the Rebbe brings the famous, one of the classic examples of these Shnei Ksuvim is from where did the Eibush to speak to Moshe Rabbeinu, or to the Eden from the Mishkan. So one place it says from the Tach Shnei Badi HaOren on the Kaperis, Mal Kaperis. The voice came out from above the Kaperis, the cover in the Oren, which means from Kodesh Kodashim. Another place it says Veidaber Hashem Pesach El Meid. Pesach El Meid means at the door of the outer section, not Kodesh Kodashim. So where did the voice come from? So then the Parsha Nosei, he says it came out from Al Kaperis, but it traveled through Pesach. Those both are true. It originated in the Kodesh Kodashim in the Oren, but then it traveled through the Pesach El Meid. Rashi brings, that's the reconciliation. So the Rebbe asked the question, why couldn't the Pasuk L'Chatchila say, Ma'ala Kaperis, the Pesach El Meid? So that way you don't have this question. So the Rebbe said, because Elikus wants both elements. It wants one side, it should be pure Elikus. Where's more pure Elikus, at Pesach El Meid or in the Kodesh Kodashim? Kodesh Kodashim, it's much more pure. Pesach El Meid is also not a low madrege, but it's out. And the other wants the terms. Should hear just Malmai Lamat, wants it to be in a way that Al Pesach El Meid. So each pasuk is focusing on the Maila that each one has. Yesh B'zeh Mashem B'zeh. For it comes from the Kodesh Kodashim. Another place it says the focus is on how Elikus is heard Mechutz L'El Meid, Al Pesach El Meid. And the pasuk Ashlishi comes to say the truth is they both can be connected. Because when you go to Nimna Hamanim Noyes, like he says in the Maimon, Tavshin Chafal, Basal Legani, you have both. A Elikus on his terms, you have a Elikus on our terms, Pesach El Meid, and the truth is they both come, they're one voice. At the end of the day, it's going to be one voice. But you can't jump there because you have to go through this done. And basically in the language of Chassidus, Mamala Kalal Atzmus. Why don't you just jump to Atzmus? Because then it's not on our terms. It won't have both elements. Or terms, Kalim, Eris, Kalim, and Atzmus. Same idea. So you always need to have these three dimensions. Okay. With that, let's see. Anybody has any questions? Because I finished the Maimer 140, gave a little overview. Anybody have any questions on what we learned? One second, let me. You guys are very well behaved these days. I usually have all kinds of arguments and questions. What's going on? Rab Shlomi, you can't find something?
You prepared it well for Yud Shvat.
Okay, good. Since we do have some, I have a guest that's actually by me right here, has a question. So I'll ask us, he'll ask a question. I'll respond. If you have questions, I'll take it in a minute. Let me just take this question. Do you think it connects to what we see about the Gani to the That's exactly what I was hinting to, yeah. I just spoke about it the other day. Just pointing out about the connection with the Basal Gani we discussed from Elov Elela Midesov, Taich of the Pardes, it's in Eris Hamislapshin Bekalim. The Taich of the Baal Shem Tov Elov is the Sheresh HaKelim. And the Alter Rebbe comes, Pirush HaPoshet, is Nimna Atzmos Nimna Nimnois. And the Rebbe explains, it's really one in Yud Shvat Tov Shem Beis. I discussed it. And even in the Maimer, he hints to that, the Pirush HaPnimi. And it's really, because ultimately, when you understand the Ramak, Api Chabad, and you understand the Baal Shem Tov, you come that you must have Atzmos, because Haro is there, Iyu v'chayu echad and Iyu v'garmu echad. You ultimately need Keich Atzmos. But I remember when we were Bachrim, and we started to learn these inyanim, I remember asking my mashpim, Melech and Ibad L'chaim, Yael, Rabbi Yael, I said, one second, if we end up anyway having to come to Atzmos, why do you need to go through all these levels? You know, the klotz kasha we all have. You know, just like when we're young, where people say, Sevenzel Vumeret, and it frustrates you. What do you mean, Venzel Vumeret? Is it this or is that? Is it salt or is it sugar? And then you get a little older, you come to realize the world is not Salt and sugar are taka different. And the milk goes on one place, milchik is here and fleishik is here. But when you go into Elam Salyanim, it's not quite defined in Mokim and Zman the way we understand things. And taka, everything is lefierach, everything is defend. So when you're younger, it's harder to understand because it sounds like mathematical. If you're getting to Atzmus anyway, what do you need the journey? So that would be the equivalent of someone saying, since Tachas Hayidiyah Shalei Neda, since at the end of the day, the ultimate knowledge is I'm not going to know, it's beyond me, so what do I have to learn in the first place? I remember the joke when we were in high school, we published it in our yearbook. The principals didn't like it. We wrote like this: the more you learn, the more you study, the more you forget. The more you forget, I'm sorry, no. The more you learn, the more you know. The more you know, the more you forget. The more you forget, the less you know. The less you know, the less you forget, the more you know. What did I say? Yeah. So at the end of the day, why study? Again, the more you know, the more you learn, the more you know. The more you know, the more you forget. The more you forget, the less you know. The less you know, the less you forget. So why study? Yeah, the less you know, the less you forget. So why study? So what's the logic? Obviously, it doesn't work that way. It's not a container of water where you put in a quart and then you pour it out and put it in another quart. Because when a child, mispal ledaze atinuk, says, I don't know, that's because he's lifnei hayidiyah. He didn't go through the Aveda. When a person who's a chacham gadol says, I don't know, tachas hayidiyah shlei neda, he's informed by all that he knows. So his knowledge is not like he's saying, oh, everything I know is worthless. No, the knowledge itself leads you to a place that's beyond knowledge. By a child, it's before knowledge. It's lower than knowledge. By him, it's beyond knowledge. So b'meila, they'll get to Atzmus. To really appreciate Atzmus, you have to go through things that, since we are not Atzmus, we first have to understand it on our terms, step by step by step. Anyway, this you come to learn as you go, you get older, you start appreciating these ideas.
Is this what
Remember also, Tachlis Hayidiyah Shalei Neda doesn't just mean that the ultimate of knowledge is I don't know. It means Chassidus teaches even deeper. You know the unknowable. You actually unmargish something that may not be understood in pure logic, but you still can experience it. So knowing is not everything is about purely understanding. Sometimes it's a hargosha in the emes of something, like we learned about hisamtus, riyah, it resonates. The resonating experience is much deeper than just knowledge. It's not like Bina is ich verstehe. Chochmeh is the Ayin Herzach. So you're talking about something that's like it says in Perek Lamed Hey in Tanya, that Chochmeh is the place that we experience. What's the question? Hu levade ve'en zolase, the ultimate bittul. So ultimate bittul is what you experience to go higher.
It's like the Hayom Yom. The difference is in the aha.
Yeah, exactly.
is what you just said related to what you said in the giving over Basi Lagani, the chapter 11 yesterday, the recording you made that you put out, and at the end, I think it was either in discussing that or you were answering one of two shilas, and you were saying how a Tinok prays directly to Hashem. He doesn't know from any of the Seder Histalshus. And you said, as we get older, we start to understand the kelim in the different midos and what chesed, gvura, whatever we may need in our lives. And so in that sense, we're still praying to God, but maybe to a specific aspect of what he brings down to this place. But then there was a Rabbi who said, no, I pray like a baby. And is that what you mean now when you're saying it's not, it's that he's praying above this to the transcendent, but it's with knowledge of what's everything below. Is that what you were trying to say?
Yeah, to put it more bluntly, a tinuk, an actual child or ish pashut, doesn't have an option even. The only thing he knows is the Eibishter. He prays like the child that cried kukeri-ku on Rosh Hashanah. Then there's a person who's very knowledgeable, and yes, he can get trapped in the Giluyim, but then the kavanah is that the person that is knowledgeable should pray like a child. So let me give you a mashal of the Baal Shem Tov that really captures it well. And then you have the mile of both. Because the child, remember, doesn't have Giluyim. The second category has Giluyim, but he doesn't have Etzem. And the kavanah is that the etzem should come begili. So the Baal Shem Tov gives a mashal, beautiful mashal. And the pasuk says, Tfilah la'oni, ki yatif, lefnei Hashem eshpech sichi. So he says, why oni? When you pray to God, you should stand like an usher. You should be standing proud like a gvir, like a wealthy person. Why like a pauper? So he touches it with the end of the lefnei Hashem eshpech sichi. So he says the mashal. Two people were invited to see a king. One is a literate, educated aristocrat. He knows all the literature and all the music and all kolatera kula, nigla, primis, everything. The second one that's invited is a ish pashat, a simpleton. No yedias, he's not a Talmud Chacham, doesn't have any scholarship, doesn't have knowledge. Simple person like a child, little child. They both come to, first comes the Talmud Chacham, the sophisticated one. He never went into such a palace. He goes into the palace. It's beautiful. Here he sees a collection of svarim and literature from all the generations. He gets caught up and starts looking. I never saw this book, first edition. He knows, he appreciates. Then he sees art and he hears music. He gets so mesmerized and so consumed with all these, the majesty of the king. What happens? He misses his appointment. Okay, then comes the ish pashut. He doesn't know anything. He doesn't know how to read. He's illiterate. So he doesn't appreciate the books. He doesn't appreciate the art, doesn't appreciate the music. He doesn't appreciate the architecture. He doesn't appreciate anything. What does he do? He goes straight into the inner sanctum with the king and spends time with the king. And there he could ask the king, you know what, teach me, give me a bracha that I should appreciate all your giluyim, all your revelations. Says the Baal Shem Tov. So when you stand before the Eibishter, suspend all your sophistication and all your chachmas and everything you know. Stand like a child, like an oni, like a pauper. Not that he's advocating illiteracy. Like I said yesterday in my shiur, I said, so what? So now everybody should, Rosh Hashanah should come and say kukuriku? No. Suspend that so you can experience the etzem without all the fireworks and packaging. But the Eibishter created that packaging. He created a structure because he wanted us also to personally relate to it. So as we grow, the goal is to be a Talmid Chacham, to be knowledgeable. That's why when it comes to things like astrology, of course the stars have certain insights, dreams, but you don't want to escape to the stations. You want to always know that it's all about one God. You don't want to get stuck in the outer chambers of godliness. So that's why you need both. The Tinuk teaches us how to connect directly. But an adult has to use all the sophisticated tools to not be distracted by them, but to recognize that chesed leads me to atzmus, gvura to atzmus, tiferes to atzmus. So the Ramak is talking about how Eir is megal elokus, the grandeur of the divine Eir. But if you get stuck in Eir, you're never going to reach the etzem. That's why the Alter Rebbe says the Pirush HaPoshet, even in the Ramak, the Eir is meant to lead you to etzem. The Baal Shem Tov comes and says it's kelim. You have to bring it into Hamshach, into kelim. Every detail is rooted also iyu v'garmu echad elav v'leila midesa. And then comes the Alter Rebbe says all this Eiris and kelim is meant to lead us to the third dimension, nimna nimnois, that joins it all together. So you need to go through these stages, but at the same time not be stuck and distracted by them. That's the whole point. If you learn Sheirish Mitzvahs HaTfilah, especially chapters 8 and 9, that whole section, it really comes together. So the Maimer Chaf Aleph can be much, when you look into Sheirish Mitzvahs HaTfilah, you really can understand it a lot better if you're going to do some delving in.
For sure.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Shkoyach. And Gedantif on Yud Shvat coming.
So everyone should have a Freiliche Yud Shvat. We're going to stop here. We finished Maimer 140, top of page 1175.